This is the Exvangelical Bible Study. I'm Sarah, and I am here with Justin. And last week we covered the first six chapters of Genesis. And so this week we are just going to kind of keep plowing on through and dive in. So thanks for being here, Justin.
Well, I'm glad to be here with you, Sarah. And I guess we're about to dive in because I think we're starting with the flood, aren't we?
Yeah, it's flood time.
Hope you brought a life preserver.
Oh no, you don't get those. All right. So we did the first part of chapter
Right,
six
right,
where God was mad at everybody and he says, I'm sorry I ever made them.
right. Yeah.
And then we get introduced to Noah.
Isn't it weird?
Um,
Did we talk about this last week? But isn't it weird that God like regretted something, being that he's supposed to be all knowing?
yeah. There's actually a lot of this in these next couple chapters of God regretting and God sort of finding things out and
Yeah.
God having to remind himself of things. Yeah, I think it's another example of when God appears very human.
Yeah, I agree. There's a good book on this I've been meaning to pitch during my lives, and I don't know if I've ever brought it up, but there's a book called When Gods Were Men by
Oh,
Esther Hamori. She's phenomenal, by the way. But anyone watching this, if you want to know more about that particular topic, because I don't think we're going to talk about it too much tonight, but that's a really good book on the topic by like a world-renowned scholar. So,
nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, the Lord was sorry he ever made them, and then the Lord said, I will completely wipe out this human race that I have created. Yes, and I will destroy all the animals and birds too. Now, what did the birds do?
those poor
Seems
birds.
especially petty, particularly because a flood is coming. Like, the flood is not going to directly kill the birds.
Right.
So they're just gonna slowly like die of starvation or
Yeah. So I was having similar questions because God says he's going to kill everything, right? So if we go to put it on the screen, verse 19, it says, and every living thing of all flesh you're going to bring on the ark. And then everything not on the ark, all living things of all flesh that are not on the ark, they're gone. They're dead, right? So I guess the thing of it is some of these animals, I don't fully know how they're going to die yet. You know what I mean?
yeah, I mean there's certainly lots of sorry, Ruby's drinking. Um very many kinds of animals that can survive being underwater for a while. And it's not addressing the animals that live in the water in any way, right? So yeah, it's not very clear
No,
to
and
me.
some people have pointed out, for example, when you go to 17, it says, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, which is the breath. I'm sorry, all flesh in which is the breath of life. So you might be inclined to believe that this would exclude maybe the fish or some of the aquatic animals, but I don't know. I feel like here's the thing. They had to have died as well, right? Because like when the salt water and the freshwater mix, like a lot most of these animals, like saltwater animals can't live in freshwater and freshwater animals can't live in saltwater, so they had to die too.
I mean, unless this like magical water that was coming up was salt water. I mean, maybe the flood was salt. It could have been not fresh water.
Yeah, that certainly could be possible. And to your point of the birds, I guess birds have breath in their lungs, so they got to die too. But it's not immediately clear how they die because they're
Right.
theoretically not affected by the flood, like ducks,
The
right?
ducks
That
are fine.
the I think the ducks are going to make it, aren't they?
Yes.
Certainly, maybe some of the penguins.
Yeah. Yep. but they had a spot on the ark, so they're fine.
That's true. Yeah, the penguins. Yeah, they crawled all the way from the Antarctic to the Ark in the Middle East. In 100-degree weather.
They did. They were good penguins. Well, what's really funny is so this Bible that I'm working with, that's this living translation or whatever, and it has these little inserts of like, and for anyone's watching, like this is like little text to tell you about the text, right? And so this one says. Many have wondered how this animal kingdom roundup happened. Did Noah and his sons spend years collecting them? In reality, the creation along with Noah was just doing as God commanded. There seemed to be no problem gathering the animals. God took care of the details of that while Noah was doing his part by building the boat.
So magic.
Don't ask questions. Don't worry about the logistics. It's not important. It just happened.
It's so bad. Well, so the ancient rabbis had some theories, and believe it or not, the Quran mentions this as well, that in order to wipe out the fish, God had to do some additional stuff. Like God brought all the animals himself, including like whatever animals he had to do magic for.
Mm-hmm.
But then he also managed to kill off all the aquatic animals by making the water boil.
Oh.
Isn't that an interesting one?
So we're going to drown everyone, and if they don't drown, we need to boil them.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was how King Og was able to survive. Because remember, it says later King Og survived the flood, being the last of the Rephaim, the giants. And so you might ask, how in the world did King Og survive, right? And so they have this narrative in the Talmud that King Og, along with one other like mystical animal, clung on to the side of the ark. And yeah, he survived the flood for an entire year, along with one of these animals with big old horns they tied to the side of the ark, and just waited it out for 371 days. And the question came up, how did he not die in the boiling water? And they say... So
that's the problem with this.
I know, right? So the animal is typically referred to as a rama. It's a horned animal of some unknown characteristic. So the rama and also King Og were clinging onto the ark, and it says that God performed a miracle by cooling the water on the outside of the ark, because the ark was made from wood and pitch, and the pitch would melt in the boiling water. So they said God did a miracle so that the pitch wouldn't melt. And because the pitch wouldn't melt because he cooled the water around the boat, that means King Og and the Rama was allowed to survive the flood. And so even in like Jewish tradition, they had the same questions as you. Is like, logistically, how did everything actually happen? And you have to start inventing details like your study Bible, right? God must have done X, Y, or Z, right?
What did he eat for a year? Like, never mind the boiling water. Maybe he could climb up high enough, but like, what did he eat?
Well,
how did he contract his muscles for an entire year? Like, what? When did he sleep? Like, it's...
Well, remember, if God is just doing miracles here, right, then God can do more miracles. Like if he does miracle 1, he could do miracle 2, right?
And honestly, that is what I hear a lot for people who do take this story literally. Is like, I don't know, but God can do miracles, so it's all fine, and the details aren't really that important.
That tends to be the thing, right? So if you have a God that can do anything, right, then any plot hole in the story can be resolved with God. You just plug God into the plot holes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if it still doesn't make sense, then you can blame our human fallibility and minds and say, well, it doesn't make sense to you, but you're just a human. And
right.
So if it still seems illogical, it's just because God is so much smarter than you.
Right. Yeah. Listen, if you don't understand it, it's because your peanut brain can't grasp it. And God is just, he is so much larger than us, and so much beyond us. We can't grasp the nature of God. But like, we could use that excuse for anything. Like if you use that excuse for the Hindu gods and Christians were like, well, listen, these gods don't make any sense to me. And you said, well, they're just beyond your understanding. Do you think they would deal well with that?
I do not.
I don't think so.
Shockingly, no. No, I don't think they would.
Yeah.
Yep.
Color me surprised.
Well, I do want to get into the boat
Right.
because
Yeah.
you, sir, are an engineer, and I'm very excited to hear your analysis here. It has very specific instructions for this boat, right? It's made from resinous wood, sealed with tar inside and out. It tells you the length and the width and the height. There's an opening all the way around the boat below the roof, and then three decks inside the boat. Right. Okay. What's the word for ability to float? What is the sailability of this vessel?
Well, so I think in terms of sailability, like you can get it to float. Like, you got a big old pocket of air surrounded by wood. I think the floatability is okay, even if it's super heavy. I do think though, like I think the biggest problem with the ark though is that because of the size of the boat and the dimensions of the boat, it'd be like long and it would have a tendency to really twist and turn in the water because there's not a lot holding it in shape. And modern boats, they have like metal strapping, and even in the Bible, in fact, it talks about there's an occasion where the boat was gonna run aground, and it talks about
Mm-hmm.
the strapping of the boat. So there's this idea that these ancient boats needed to have some sort of rigging on the bottom side of it to keep it from warping, because that's the nature of wooden boats. So most structural engineers, I've read way back in the day analysis from a structural engineer on this boat, and the basic consensus is if it didn't twist itself to the point where it came apart, then it would still probably end up twisting enough that it would be taking in water. Because remember, they had to seal the outside of the boat with pitch. So even if it didn't self-destruct, it would still destruct enough that it would have gaping, water holes in it. So that's kind of a problem. One of the bigger issues is it doesn't really say much about how well it would prevent itself from capsizing. So a boat of that
Oh.
size typically needs to have a vertical mass below the water line to keep it balanced and make sure it doesn't capsize. And so, like when I was in, very early in my engineering educational journey, there was an engineering project we had to do. It was really fun. It was one of my favorite projects. And I guess I was probably 17 or 18. And the goal was they took the class and they gave us 2 rolls of duct tape and like 2 cardboard moving boxes. And they put everybody in teams of 4. And then your team had to create a boat using cardboard and duct tape. And then the 4 of you had to get into that boat and make it across the pond. We had a big old pond on campus, and you had to get that thing across without sinking. And one of the hardest things is when you load up a boat of that nature, it doesn't stabilize automatically. Like there's a lot of tricks you have to do to stabilize the boat in the water. And so like some boats have ballasts, so they'll have like these air pockets along the side of it that prevent it from getting too cattywampus in the water. Some of them have like is it a keel? Is that what they call it?
I don't
Um,
know.
so some boats have large I'm going to call it a keel. Yeah, it's the keel is the bottommost longitudinal structure element in the watercraft. So they have a long keel going into the water to keep it balanced, and also help it to fly straight, or to go straight. And then some of them could have like big old stones strapped to the outside of it that sink down into the water to keep it balanced. But we're not told of any of these things. Like we're not told that the boat
Right.
had any of these designs. So like you're kind of left wondering, like, if God's are the boat plans complete? Because if that's it, if those are the only instructions Noah was given, then he must have known a lot about boats to keep that thing afloat. He must have improvised something. But that was a long answer to a short question. The real answer is no. That thing would not be seaworthy.
Good to know.
Did you ever think about the building process?
Yeah, so I mean, he's in the desert, right?
I mean,
Not
essentially,
a lot of really big trees
yeah.
around, right? I mean, but again, I think we get into that miracleness, right?
Hmm.
So if there weren't a lot of trees for Noah, it's okay. God will just make them, right? And like how is he going to lift,
Yes.
create things to lift the big whatever? It's okay. God just made it light enough, right? Like
Right.
you can any of those like you were saying plot holes, we can fix with a miracle.
So, because that, I think that's where you have to go with it, right? Because, like, have you ever seen the building of like the Titanic or any of the large vessels? I want to show a picture on the screen, and this is pretty classic. There's a lot of under construction type of images of
Mm,
some of these large boats. But if you look at like just the amount of structure you need to build the thing, because you've got to
right.
keep it stable. You can't fall over while you're building it. You've got scaffolding so you can get up and around it. Like there's so much that goes into building a large watercraft, that like this idea that Noah and his two sons, they're just gonna whip it together. Like I know they had a long time. They had like 100 years to build it. It's like actually closer to 80 years to build it technically if you add up the ages. But still, yeah, even if you have 80 years, like, and I actually have a background in engineering. It's not mechanical engineering, so, but I do have a background in engineering, and like even me think with two other guys, I don't know if I could build a seaworthy ark in 80 years. There has to be a miracle somewhere.
Yeah, like even if you have enough time, you have to defy physics in order to do it.
Yeah, basically. And think about this too. Um, the wood that they would have needed to use is not native to their area. Like they would have needed probably cedar trees from Lebanon.
Okay, how far away is Lebanon?
Well, I mean, from we're not necessarily told exactly where Noah was from. The boat came to rest in the mountains, of Ararat, but we don't really know where Moses was from. But if he was from Mesopotamia, like to say generically somewhere in Mesopotamia, well, generically, if you live anywhere in Mesopotamia, you're about 100 to 200 miles from the cedar forest.
Okay.
So it does work out though. If we imagine for a second that Noah resided close to where the boat landed, he was residing near the mountains of Ararat. If that was the case, there are cedars up there he had access to, but we're not really told.
Okay. Well, we put a little magic, a little miracle, we get it done.
It's always the magic. But listen, what if God did an extra magic trick, and when like the horses and the oxen and the other animals came in, they just brought the magically felled wood with them. Like God just had it land on their backs and they carried it with them. I mean, if when you start invoking magic, anything is possible.
Yep. Yep, it sure is. Well, I in there's several times in the next couple passages where it does that thing you were talking about last time, that we have part of the story and suddenly we're starting the story over again. And I know you were explaining how we're essentially merging like two versions of the story together. And so, that's going to happen several times, but right at the beginning of chapter 7, um, it is it's telling us the story of when the flood actually physically begins,
Right.
and it keeps getting the details wrong. Um,
It's so true. It's so true.
Right? So it says, like, okay, first everyone is going to get on the boat. It says they came on the boat in pairs as God commanded. And then verse 10 says, 1 week later, the flood came and covered the earth. And so then it says, it starts over in the next paragraph when Noah was 600 years
Right.
old. This is going to happen again. And it says in verse 12, the rain continued to fall for 40 days and 40 nights, but Noah had gone into the boat that very same day. So Noah either goes into the boat a week ahead of time or he goes into the boat the day that the waters begin.
Right. So there's a lot of contradictions in like the Noah story. And if you give me a second, actually, I've got a Kindle version of a really interesting book. Um, it's called The Bible with Sources Revealed. It's by Richard Elliott Freeman. And what he does is he goes through the 4 different redactional sources for the Bible. So, and he parses out the 2 different redactors, the 2 different versions of this story, and makes a pretty compelling case for why there was actually 2 separate narratives. And they make a lot more sense. Like the contradictions actually go away when you split them up into their actual sources. Give me a second, see if I can pull it up. I don't know if I can show if it's easy enough to show my Kindle books on the screen, but I'll try it in a second. But that being said, you've already read the story, which while you're asking questions, did you list all of the contradictions, or did you notice many of them?
Well, I'm not that organized, but I starred them in my text. I did
Okay.
not create a spreadsheet.
Okay. Because there are contradictions.
So, and when you say the looking at the different versions, the contradictions disappear, is that because you're separating it into 2 separate stories?
Yeah.
So then the stories would contradict each other, but that's okay because they're different stories. Is that what you mean?
Basically, yeah. If you separate the 2 stories completely, then I mean they would still contradict. The 2 stories would contradict each other. But the details wouldn't be so like glaring. Whereas like Noah was told to collect 2 of every animal, and then in the next story he's now collecting 7 of the clean animals. Or
Mm-hmm.
it was going to rain for 40 days and nights, but he actually ends up on the boat for a little over a year. Uh, those contradictions are no longer like side by side, but they are
Okay,
still.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense. Well, in the in this second version here, starting at verse 11, what's really fun, I thought, is, with them in the boat were pairs of every kind of breathing animal, domestic and wild, large and small, along with birds and flying insects of every kind. Well, now hold on. You telling me this boat is full of bugs? And not only is it full of bugs, it's full of the flying bugs.
Right.
Because I don't want anything to do with that.
Yeah. It's wild that God saw fit to preserve that kind of stuff. Because, again, if he's already doing miracles, like he's already doing magic, what do you need the
Right.
bugs for? They're not going to serve any
Yeah.
purpose, are they?
I mean, it is an interesting, like, if we are thinking about this from a biological perspective, then yes, of course you would need the bugs.
Right.
But if we're thinking about this from a biological perspective, then the rest of it falls apart.
Right. So here is the sources split up from the book. And so you'll see the very first is in green, the beginning of the story, where God is like announcing that he's going to do this stuff. And then the blue text starts the first narration. And then you'll see it goes all the way through chapter 6. So according to Richard Elliott Freeman, it's pretty coherent until you get to chapter 7. Then all hell breaks loose. But
Yeah.
and that's where you start finding the contradictions. They start kind of in chapter 7, right? It says Noah
Mm-hmm.
did according to all that he had commanded him. And then we have this weird statement, and Noah was 600 years old when the flood was water on the earth. And Noah and his wife and sons, so on and so forth, came to the ark. And then if you go to chapter 8, you got all kinds of nonsense where like the same information is repeated. Like it says here again in verse
Mm-hmm.
13, and it was 600 and so on and so forth. So I only bring this up to say, if you have $4 floating around, it's $3.99 for the Kindle edition. If you've got $4 burning a hole in your pocket, you can get the Kindle edition of the Bible with sources revealed by Richard Elliott Freeman, and you can actually just take the blue text and the green text and copy it, paste it into two different Word documents and read them side by side, and you can see that the stories actually line up a lot better. I mean, like you already said, they still contradict each other. But
Yeah, but two separate stories makes a lot more sense
right,
than the way that the text is read.
right.
So we have this flood of rain and probably underground waters that burst forth, right?
Yeah, the springs.
Yeah, well, and it, again, sorry, Ruby. Again, I have this version. So my version says, on the 17th day of the second month, the underground waters burst forth on the earth, and the rain fell in mighty torrents.
Yeah.
So that's back to like that whole dome thing we were talking about, right? Where like water it can come into you kind of like from every which way.
Yeah, pretty much what he's saying. Yeah. So we've got floodwaters from the ground up, the springs. You got flood and the windows of heaven opening up and flooding all the water, even from the other side of the firmament. And that seems to be their explanation for where all the water came from. The question that I always had is, where did they think it went to? Like, 'cause it couldn't have evaporated and went back into the atmosphere, because it would, there'd be too much of it. It couldn't go anywhere. It's trapped by the firmament.
Well, if the firmament has a window, I mean, it probably has like a back door, just open up the back door and off it goes.
Fair enough. Yes, yeah, very good point. And if God is in control of these windows, and he invented how rain works, I'm sure he could figure out how to get the evaporated rain back out the window.
Yeah, it'll just, off it goes out the window.
Just need a
Well,
strong
it
wind.
doesn't right? All it says in here is that like the water recedes, like
Right.
it doesn't really give us any more information.
Right.
And it goes on. I was trying to I know I heard you have the exact number of days, but it was like, okay, 150 days, and then the boat comes to rest, and then 2.5 months the waters start to go down, and then there's another 40 days,
Yep.
and then he does the dove, and then there's another like 2 more months, and then finally we can leave the ark.
So it's a little disjointed, as you said. Like what? So I did a spreadsheet a while ago with the days, because if you add up all the
Of
days,
course you did.
you get about, I think it was 371.
Okay.
But when you're in chapter 6, okay? So in chapter 6, it just says, the flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth, and the water swelled. So, okay, cool. So you might be led to believe that the water went up for 40 days and 40 nights, because it concludes, and all flesh died. Cool. So it rained for 40 days and everything died. I mean, what more do you need? And it says, only Noah was left, and those with him remained in the ark, and the waters swelled on the earth. And then we get this statement in 24. For 150 days. What do you mean 100? Where'd the 150 come from?
That's a few more than we earlier discussed.
Right. So there are some serious questions, and let me see what they did with that. There we go. So if you go to the Bible with sources revealed by Richard Elliott Freeman, he's actually making the case that verse 24 was actually part of the next section of text. So if you go to the end of chapter 7 for Genesis, it's got it listed as the priestly source. So the priestly source is in contrast with the, I think it was a Yahwistic source, which is why it seems so weird that it's like, wait, where do we get this new number from? And it gets worse because the numbers come back around, because there's more.
There's so many. It's
right?
yes, more and more. Well, and so this, like, the way this ends is really interesting in that when I was a Christian and reading this, I just didn't think that much about it, but they're describing this boat is kind of running aground at the top of a mountain, and it just sits at the top of the mountain for a while until the water is receded enough.
Right.
And then you're opening the ark, and all of the animals are just leaving the ark, and they are not in the right, potentially the right climate, right? They don't, all the plants are dead.
They're gone.
Um, right. Although I guess, well, the dove, right? Didn't the dove bring back an olive leaf or something?
Yeah, at the very end of it.
So maybe the plants are coming back. But now you have all of these animals. Are they all supposed to just hang out there, or like they're supposed to start reproducing, but they're not supposed to start eating each other, right? Like they're able to like make some generations before they eat each other. It's a logistical nightmare.
It really is. And everything you said is like, I think if you're reading the text slowly, like you'll see it, and you can't unsee it, right?
Yeah.
The problem is, I don't know if people are actually reading it very slowly because, as you said, the logistics are a problem, right? So, the herbivores, right? There are herbivores that were on the ark. What are they eating? Like after they disembark from the ark, we're kind of led to believe that maybe there was some herbs that regrow because the bird was able to go and get a olive leaf, and that's great. But like, is there enough to sustain new wildlife? Like, is that a thing?
I mean, I
Um,
guess you only have two, right?
but like giraffes, they eat a ton.
Oh, yeah. Well, and it's interesting to try to figure out how many of these animals there are. And I know when
Right.
you and I went to the Creation Museum, they were really kind of heavy on this word kind rather than species.
Yeah.
And so for anyone who's not maybe biologically inclined, species is how we would delineate these different types of animals, and the term kind is not like a scientific categorization. And because it's not a scientific categorization, you can make it mean whatever you want it to mean. And so to say that, well, there was one of every kind, does that mean, are we lumping together not just like all the leopards and the big cats? Is there just one big cat? Are we
Hmm.
right? Like, how big are we talking? Is it just one cat at all that somehow is going to now evolve into all of the different species of cat? And so that's something that gives people a lot of wiggle room since it's not actually a defined term.
I think you're right. I think it was the Creation Museum. Now that we're on it, they did an estimate of how many kinds because we can't go by species because they don't believe in evolution. But I think they had a little over 6,000 different kinds. So it'd be quite a bit. Um,
Yeah. I mean, if you've got at minimum 12,000 animals, and then, some of them we've got seven pairs, like, there's no way.
yeah, it's weird. It doesn't add
And
up.
no. And obviously, I am not the first to bring up this point. Many other people have. But what are you going to feed them, and what are you going to do with all the poop? It's just a
Yeah.
logistical nightmare.
Well, and think of how many like illnesses are born out of unproperly handled fecal matter. It's
Oh,
quite a bit.
yes, it is. And what are
Um,
they drinking? Like,
that was another thing is it's if we assume it's raining fresh water, then they must have a system for collecting the fresh water. But like, how much can you actually collect? Because the animals have to drink water. as well, not just the humans. Now, some people will say, well, God put the animals to sleep. Like,
Oh yeah.
that doesn't make any sense because God told them to load up the ark with food, presumably for them and for the animals. Um, and that creates problems too.
Yeah. It says, and remember to take enough food for your family and for all the animals.
Exactly.
So
So,
yeah, the going to sleep thing is, look at you, debunked that
right?
one.
So the problem is like you already know this. A lot of these animals, like herbivores, can't eat meat typically, and a lot of meat eaters can't have herbs. So like you have to have fresh meat for the lions. You have to have fresh meat for a lot of the meat eaters. Like the bears need fresh meat. Like just well, some of the bears do berries and whatnot. I mean, some bears are meat eaters. They're kind of foragers, I guess. But anyways, the long and short of it is like you can't store meat on a boat for over a year. That's crazy.
Well, nor can you get fresh vegetables, right? I
Right.
mean, for the herbivores, you can't store fresh vegetables for 6,000 herbivores for a year.
And even the
There's no way.
grain, let's imagine that like you're like, okay, we're going to collect barley grain for, I don't know, 80 years or some whatever. We're going to collect barley grain because we can silo it and store it, once it's dried and everything. But even if you say, well, listen, God did a miracle and all the animals are eating barley now. It still doesn't solve the problem because you just run into more issues. Like if you put a bunch of barley into a collection bin, whatever, a gigantic collection bin on the boat, well, moisture is still going to get in there, and that. So I do some beer brewing, and so I have to keep grain. And most grain, if there's even a hint of moisture, goes bad like within a month or two. You can't just store it infinitely. So certainly in a flood, whatever grain you've got stored up for the animals, it must have been preserved by miracle. So every problem with the flood comes down to you have to believe God is doing more and more miracles. Everything is just a miracle.
Yeah. Well,
But
and I'm sure it would be really heavy too, right? To
oh my gosh.
store enough grain to feed 12,000 animals for a year. I
Mhm.
mean, isn't that going to sink your boat?
Yeah. So, and that's the other thing too is like, okay, so if God is doing all these miracles to get around common sense, then what's the point in preserving all these animals? What are you doing with yourself? Why are you preserving all these
Hmm.
animals? Just tell Noah to get his family on a boat, take their favorite animals with them. Maybe you'll have some fun pets and call it a day. The goal of the Noah
Yeah.
story is to demonstrate how there is like how there are living creatures that existed after the flood. So, and the explanation is, well, God gave Noah the information. He told Noah to go collect the animals, and because Noah did this, that's how the animals were preserved. So, it's not initially framed as like a totally supernatural story. But once you get into the
Yeah.
logistics, then you have to start invoking the supernatural because it no longer makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if it's going to be a miracle, why are you making this poor guy spend 80 years building a boat? Seems kind of mean.
Right. And if you read the stories of Noah that came before Noah, it's clear that the story was never meant to be a story of God's magic. The story was meant to be a story of God giving the human beings the information that was needed to preserve. So, like, I've got a
Right.
layout. Let me see if I can get it big enough of the other flood stories. So the earliest is the Eridu Genesis story. It's from the third millennium. I mean, we're talking like 2,000 years prior to Noah. We already had a flood story. And then another one in their Atrahasis epic, which is probably 700, 800 years before the biblical one was written. The Gilgamesh epic has its own flood story, and then finally we get the biblical story. So we've got three different editions of the flood story, all roughly the same days. All this narrative where God's like, listen, I'm going to flood the world. I'm going to kill everything. I didn't like the thing that happened. We got to wipe it all clean, but I'm going to give somebody the information they need to survive it. And we're not told in the other stories that God did a bunch of magic.
Right.
You know,
Yeah. Well, it's um Yeah, I think it continues to show God being much more human. So like when they get off the boat, everything comes out pair by pair, except for I guess seven. And then so Noah has to build an altar and sacrifice the
Mm,
animals, but I guess these were the extra ones, right, that he had brought. And so we also then see God making a promise a couple of times, and this is the first one where he says, I will never curse the earth again. And this was interesting to me because this quote is, I will never again curse the earth, destroying all living things, even though people's thoughts and actions are bent toward evil from childhood.
right? Yeah.
In like I understand the Christian perspective of like the fall and we're all bad because of Adam and Eve. So like I'm familiar with that theology, but it seems like a strange action that God is saying, okay, I made people and they turned out really bad, so I'm going to get rid of all of them, and then I'm gonna save the good ones, right? He's especially well, at least Noah, right? He's gonna save Noah. Those are the good ones. And as soon as the good ones walk off the ark to repopulate the earth, he's saying, "Well, you all are evil."
Yeah.
Well, what on earth was the point of all this? Like, we didn't.
Yeah.
Nothing changed.
Nothing got fixed. So you nailed it. You nailed it. So like God is like, listen, things are horrific. It's so horrific. I got to kill everything. But like the first thing he says afterwards is that things are basically still horrific. And you already know the story. What happens in the like the very next chapter? In chapter 9, Noah gets drunk. That's a sin. His son Ham does something unmentionable to him, so severely that his lineage gets cursed. So like,
Oh, I was gonna ask you about that.
oh
That
yeah,
passage is very confusing to me. So,
okay,
what's in my NLT is it says, after the flood, Noah became a farmer and planted a vineyard. One day he became drunk on some wine he had made and lay naked in his tent. Then
right.
it says, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw that his father was naked and went outside and told his brothers. And that's the only thing it says that Ham did. And, but then it says when Noah woke up, he learned what Ham, his youngest son, had done, and he cursed them. Like, what did it doesn't say he did anything.
Right. Okay. So this is really interesting. So there's this idea in the Bible of we're going to call it uncovering someone's nakedness.
Okay.
And I think it'll make more sense. I'm going to read a couple passages real quick, though. Let's look at Leviticus 18:9 real quick, and I'll put it on the screen here. So again, if you go to the sources, like Richard Elliott Friedman and others have two different sources for the uncovering of Noah's nakedness. The first source just says that his nakedness was uncovered. But we've got an interesting law in Leviticus. It says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter, whether born at home or born abroad." And then we actually have a whole chapter that keeps saying the same thing, actually. So there's a bunch of people's nakedness that you actually can't uncover. So none of you shall approach anyone near of kin to uncover nakedness. This is an idiom for having like sexual relations. Um,
Huh.
the whole chapter in Leviticus 18 is about unlawful sexual relations. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. Now listen to this though. This is where it gets really interesting. Verse 8. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. And so this has led a lot of scholars to believe that what's actually happening in Genesis chapter 8 is not necessarily that Noah, like no, his son just saw him naked. Most scholars kind of agree that what happened here was either something happened to Noah that was improper, like he was taken advantage of sexually while he was drunk, which is possible. But my theory, and a couple scholars agree with me, my theory is that he actually uncovered the nakedness of his mother, meaning he raped his mother. And that's why you could say, because, again, in Leviticus it says, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. So you could say that you uncovered your father's nakedness by saying that you slept with his wife. And that is actually a pretty clear motive. There's more of a motive for the child to sleep with his mother than there is for him to sleep with Noah. And we see this actually, and I think you're familiar with the passage, when Absalom rebels against his father David and tries to take over the kingdom. In a display of force, he takes 10 of David's wives and he rapes them on top of the palace in broad daylight. And the goal of this type of behavior is to signal to like all of the onlookers that you're now in charge. Like I didn't just take over, I slept with the king's wife.
Right.
So I think that Ham was trying to take over now that everyone's dead and it's just him, his brothers, and his father is trying to take over the hierarchy and say, I'm in charge now. I think he slept with his father's wife while he was passed out, couldn't do anything about it. And it was revealed, and it didn't go so well for him. And that's why, remember the curse that's issued? The curse is it's not to Ham. Ham is never cursed.
Yeah.
It's
Canaanite, well, his descendants, right?
Exactly. It was Canaan. But Canaan didn't do anything wrong.
It's Yahweh. Come on.
That's a great point. Yahweh would curse anybody.
He's fine with that. Well, so in my version, it just says he saw that his father was naked. And so is that like the reworking of uncovering his nakedness?
Yeah.
Okay. Because that's actually a big difference. Like it's changing the verb of like, did he just observe his father was naked or did he do the act of uncovering it? It seems like that would be a big deal to translate it that way.
Well, so we have an idiom in the Hebrew to see the nakedness. So it does literally say that he saw the nakedness of his father. So that's a real thing. And but here's what most scholars do with it. Okay, so if you read like the scholarly literature, they think that verse 23 was added later. So if you start in verse 20, it talks about how he got drunk and whatnot. And then 22 says, Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father. And then it says, and told his two brothers outside. Okay, so a lot of people think that the original story was that. And then 23 was added later, where it says, then Shem and Japheth took the garment and laid it both on their shoulders and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. And their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. So a lot of scholars are actually of the opinion that this was added later to explain what happened after. When the original story probably didn't have that. It probably said, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. And then when Noah awoke from his wine and knew that what his younger brother had done to him, so on and so forth. So that's the thing is if all you did was look at something, then when Noah woke up, there's no way for him to know something happened. He has no idea. So either one of two things had to have happened. Either something sexually happened to Noah and he woke up, it was like, I'm feeling things I shouldn't feel. Or something happened to Noah's wife, and when he woke up, she was there and said, hey, by the way, my nakedness was uncovered. But if it's just a matter of him waking up and recognizing something happened, he would have no way of knowing someone just accidentally looked at him. So my interpretation has always been that this, whatever happened, most likely happened to his wife, unfortunately. And that's it. That gets me to the final point. Sorry, this is a long explanation, but to the point, Canaan is cursed, not Ham. And you might ask yourself, well, why would Canaan be cursed? Well, if you believe that Canaan was born from the incestuous union between Ham and his mother, that fits the rest of the incestuous cursings of the Bible. So if you remember later in the story of Lot, when he sleeps with his two daughters and they produce the Moabites and the Ammonites, well, those two people groups are cursed according to the Bible. So this is an explanation for, like, listen, your people are cursed because look at the incestuous union that led to your people group existing. So with my interpretive model of Genesis 9, it actually fits the rest of the Genesis of framing these bad people groups as coming from evil, incestuous, unlawful unions. If you just assume that he did something to Noah, then you kind of lose part of that. But again, my theory could be wrong. It's possible that he just did something to Noah and not Noah's wife, and that he woke up and was like, I don't feel so good. But I don't believe for a second that in the original story, the only thing that ever happened was he just happened to gaze upon his, father's nakedness.
Yeah, well, and that makes a lot more sense now. Have been remember learning in Sunday school, like my poor volunteer Sunday school teacher, being like, "What happened?" Like, well, he just, it was about respect, and Ham was being disrespectful, and that was the problem. That's the explanation I heard.
Yeah. To be fair, like it still would have been improper to view your father naked. It still would have been improper. It would have been wrong. You weren't, you wouldn't have done it. But it's not such a serious offense that like your whole lineage would have been cursed.
Yeah. Well, I want to move to the next story, but there was one thing I wanted to point out in chapter 9 where God is saying, "Here's my covenant." And in 5 and 6, he's saying, "Murder is forbidden. Animals that kill people must die, and anyone who murders must be killed. Yes, you must execute anyone who murders another person, for to kill a person is to kill a living being made in God's image."
Right. Which verse is that again?
So, 9, 5, and 6.
Right. Let me grab it.
So, killing a person who is made in God's image is very wrong. And so, in order to punish for that crime, you are going to kill another person who's made in God's image? Like that, you're violating your own moral principle there. Like, if killing God's creation, killing people that God in God's image is wrong, how can the punishment be to do the wrong thing again?
Right. So the clue is kind of hidden in the translation. So mine says something really interesting, and yours probably says something similar, where he says, "I will require a reckoning for human life." And the reckoning here is kind of as though he's saying like the balance needs to be paid. It's like there's a blood debt now, and the blood debt needs to be paid. And so we find this later in the Bible too, actually. If you go to 2 Samuel chapter 21, I believe, we find God actually enacting this thing called blood vengeance. I remember when in the story of Cain and Abel, how Cain was like, I can't leave from here because anyone who sees me is going to kill me. Well, this is because that's how blood vengeance works. Like when you kill somebody, their family can come and kill you. It's just blood vengeance.
Yeah, I mean,
So
it's a very Greek or mythology, or very like McCoys and Hatfields kind of
yeah,
morality.
it really is. And what's really interesting is God's cool with it. And not only is he cool with it, he says that that's the natural order of things. And so when we get to 2 Samuel 21, God himself enacts, he is reminding David that, blood vengeance is real. And here's how. It says, there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years. And year after year, David inquired of the Lord. And the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul. Okay, so God sends a famine to all of Israel. because there is blood guilt on Saul for something Saul did. It says, and on his house, because he has put the Gibeonites to death, which if you read Joshua chapter 9, the Gibeonites were supposed to be protected in the land, even though they weren't Israelites. So, and the solution to this problem that Saul killed these innocent Gibeonites when he should have been protecting them was God set a famine for 3 years, allowed his people to starve. And then the solution is that 7 family members of the household of Saul were given over and killed in front of Yahweh. It says, let 7 of his sons be handed over to us, and we will impale them before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord. And then it happened. And then at the very end of the narrative, it's clear that God was happy with this. It says they did all that the king commanded, and after that, God heeded the supplication for the land. So if you wondered if blood vengeance is a thing in the Bible, not only is it a thing, it's a thing that God he makes it legitimate. He thinks it should happen.
I mean, yeah, that's what he's telling the brand new world of these brand new, beautiful, pure people to do.
Right.
It's beyond the scope of this, but I am containing a rant about objective morality. I'm trying to keep it together and not dive into that. But whew, okay.
That's a tough pill to swallow. This is one of the reasons why so many Christians are pro death penalty. You know, they're okay with capital punishment because, well,
right.
Eye for eye, baby.
Yeah. Okay, let's do, like, for our last chapter, let's do the Tower of Babel.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's a wild one.
Okay.
You didn't want to go through all the genealogies?
Oh, no, I just skipped it. I skipped right over it. Didn't even read it. Yep, sure skipped that.
Right, of course.
Okay. So, chapter 11, the whole world is speaking a single language. I mean, it's clearly the way it's discussing it, like, there's not that many people in this story. It seems like they're all kind of just in one little geographical area. And they start migrating, and then they begin to talk about construction projects. And they say, let us make great piles of burnt brick and collect natural asphalt. Let us build a great city with a tower that reaches to the skies, a monument to our greatness. And I know reading this the first time, that was pointed out of like, look, see how evil and sinful these people are, right? They want to elevate themselves. But it is interesting that the very next sentence is, this will bring us together and keep us from scattering all over the world.
Right.
And that doesn't seem like such a bad goal. Like, that seems like an okay thing. Like, hey, let's work together. We can accomplish this cool task and it'll keep us in community together.
Right.
Not so bad. But God doesn't like it. He's not cool with it. And interestingly, too, like, I know you've pointed this out before. It says, but the Lord came down to see the city and the tower people were building. So God is not omnipresent. You know, he's coming down and having a look around. And he said, look, he said, if they can accomplish this when they have just begun to take advantage of their common language and political unity, just think what they will do later. Nothing will be impossible for them. Right. And in the next 2 words, it says, come, let's go down. So I have several questions. First, God clearly seems to be afraid of these people.
Yes, you nailed it.
Right? He doesn't know what they're capable of, and he needs to stop them because something bad could happen.
Right. It's remarkable how sharp you are, and I don't know why Christians don't pick up on like these cues in the text, because they're right there. Remember in Genesis 3 when they kicked him out of the garden, it says, now man has become like one of us. We must, remove them from the garden lest they reach out and eat also from the tree of life. So this idea that, like, listen, we got to separate these humans from us somehow. So like now they're building this tower to the heavens, and they said, let us make a name for ourselves. Now, when I read this, this is, of all the stories of Genesis that are like riffing on Babylon and trying to like, well, we're going to say make fun of Babylon or whatever, I think this is the most clear. And we find in the most common narrative of all Babylon, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, we find a lot of language that shows up here. So, for example, this idea that they can build a name for themselves. Well, that's what happens in the Epic of Gilgamesh. When he realizes that he's mortal, he's going to die one day, he kind of has this epiphany that, well, actually, if I do something like really, if I do something really awesome, then I'll have like this progeny that lives on after me. And so he dreams up this idea that, well, I'm going to go to the cedar forest and defeat Humbaba and cut down the cedar trees of God and make a name for myself. I'm going to bring one of the cedars of God's back with me, right? So it's really interesting that we find the same language used here that we find in the Babylonian tales. Some people from Babylon wanting to make a name for themselves. So the only other question is like, well, what's the thing that they're doing, and why would it make a name for them? Why would anyone care? Well, I think what's actually happening here is they're trying to reach heaven and become immortal. And we've got this really interesting snippet from Gilgamesh where they say, "Who can climb to the heavens and become immortal? Only a member of the divine assembly can live forever." So I think that what's happening in this narrative is the human beings are trying to storm the heavens. They're building a tower that's tall enough that reaches into the heavens, and they're just going to go up there and they're going to join the heavens. And that's why all of the old deities lived on mountaintops, because the mountaintops were in the heavens. And that's why the ancient Babylonians built the ziggurats, that it was a mountain on earth. And so they believed they had a room at the top of the ziggurat that they kept clean. They kept food in there. They kept water in there to wash. They believed that the gods that are up in the heaven, they would build a tower to their particular god, and their god could come and rest at the top of the tower and get food and get taken care of, get cared for, have sacrifices made to them. And this was their way of communing with the gods. But we find this really interesting situation in the Genesis narrative where it seems like they're doing something more than that. They're not just building a tower that reaches into the heavens, but they're trying to get to the heavens themselves. And that would be a huge problem because that breaks the barrier. And if you read the book of Jasher, it actually talks about this. In the book of Jasher, it talks about how the tower was a problem because they're trying to get into the heavens.
Huh.
It's pretty wild.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean it's the fact that God is saying, "Ha, look at them working together. They're gonna accomplish too much. I need to slow them down." I think is so opposite of the narrative that I learned about God growing up, and I think like this is such an example of hearing what the character of God is, knowing that like in your head, here's the character of God, and then not having read all this, right? And so then you read it and you're thinking, okay, the data that I have in front of me is not actually reflecting what I was supposed to know about God. And instead of changing your conclusion, you are just trying to twist the data to fit the conclusion you already have. Because
Right.
this type of God is not loving and caring for his people,
No, no,
right? I
he's
mean, he's
not.
protecting himself against these people.
Right. But that's apparent in all of the extra biblical literature. They're scared. In fact, in the book of Jasher, it says, the building of the tower was unto them a transgression and a sin. They began to build it, and whilst they were building against the Lord God of heaven, they imagined in their hearts to war against him and to ascend into heaven. So God in this story is afraid that the human beings are going to come and take things over. Like they're going to lose their place in the divine assembly.
Right. Well, and that must be, I circled the word like come let's go down.
Mm.
Like because and like it doesn't even say who God's supposed to be talking to, but clearly he's coming down like, "Hey guys, get a load of this." Like he's clearly talking to other gods in
Yeah.
this story.
And that makes much more sense if you're familiar with a lot of the biblical language, like surrounding the divine assembly, like the other gods that exist. We catch actually a really interesting peek in Isaiah 14. You know that it's a famous chapter because everyone thinks it's about Satan, even though it's not. Um,
Mm.
but we have a really interesting snippet where he's making fun of the king of Babylon. It's an interesting, more divine assembly talk about Babylon. But he says, I will sit enthroned on the Mount of Assembly unto the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. So there's this idea that once you get into the abode of the gods, there's a bunch of them up there. It's not just the one God. There's
Mm-hmm.
there's an assembly of gods, and they commune on Mount Zaphon. And if you read the Ugaritic literature, that's where the gods live. In fact, Baal in the Bible shows up as Baal Zephon because that was Baal's mountain. He was the one that was living on that mountain, and his father El would convene the meetings of the gods on Mount Zaphon, up in the cedar forest of Lebanon. Which is why we have like amazing psalms like Psalm 82 that talks about this. And I think you and I might have already talked about this before, but listen to what it says in Psalm 82 about like the existence of other gods. It says, God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? So he's upset with the other gods for not doing their duties, right? And then he says, at the end of it, he's judging them. I say that you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals, and you will fall like any prince. So, I mean, there are other gods according to the Bible. And
Yeah.
God's just the Yahweh is just appears to be like the chief God.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty
Yeah,
crazy.
that's really interesting. It is. Yeah. So, I mean, and they kind of the ending of this story then, because, of course, I skipped the genealogy at the end. And so they then have different languages and they scatter all over the earth. And so I guess then that is, it's relieving the threat, because now humans are disorganized and can't cooperate. And I think it's just again like the antithesis of what we thought God was supposed to be. Why would God say, "Hey, I'm gonna mess this up for you guys, so that you can't cooperate"? It
Right.
just it doesn't make any sense with what I used to know about that God.
Yeah, it is weird because think about if he hadn't have done that, right? Let's imagine that everybody in the world is all speaking one language. Well, it'd make the Bible way easier to read. Like you wouldn't have to like
Yeah.
go to school and like get degrees. Like I wouldn't have had to learn a foreign language to read the Old Testament or the New
Right.
Testament. Like it sounds like bad planning.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and again, this is a God that does not know the future and has to kind of hedge his bets against risks that he sees coming down the pike.
Right. And believe it or not, we've got an ancient Sumerian edition of this particular narrative as well. So the first 11 chapters, I've said it before, like almost everything in the first 11 chapters is we find it in ancient Mesopotamian literature. And a lot of people know this, but they don't know that there's a narrative even about the tower. They call it like a giant mound in Sumerian. But there's a translation done by Chad Boscawen, that's his name, that you can find on the internet. But in the Chad Boscawen translation, it talks about how they were building this giant mound, all the people of the world, and then God confounded their work. It says, in his anger, also the secret counsel he poured out to scatter abroad, and his face he set, and he gave a commandment to make strange their speech, and their progress he impeded, so on and so forth. So, like, again, like the Bible's just like repurposing Babylonian literature and being like, oh, well, here's our take on it. Like, this isn't divine
Right.
revelation.
Yeah. Yeah. That's also a hard pill to swallow that this isn't this totally unique I mean, I think that's what I hear from Christians a lot, especially when we're talking about laws and stuff, which we'll get into later. But that this was so different and must be divine because it's setting people apart so much. And yeah, the idea. So yeah, I think it's difficult to learn if you believe that the
Yeah.
Bible is perfect.
Yeah, that's a good point because like if you do believe that the Bible is not just perfect and inerrant, but also that it's like a divine revelation, then you've got a little bit of work ahead of you in trying to figure out why like there are multiple variants of all these stories. Like why can I find all these stories from way before the Bible was written?
Yeah. And honestly, I did not know that growing up in the church. Like, I didn't know, it wasn't something that was discussed or talked about.
Right. I remember when I was a Christian, somebody brought this up to me. I was in Bible college at the time, and I had a friend at Miami University of Ohio, not Florida. It was not the fun one. And they took a comparative literature class on this, and they were discussing some of these parallel texts from ancient Mesopotamia. And they asked me about it. They wanted to know what my take was, and I had the dumbest take ever because I was still a young apologist. And I was like, well, I mean, obviously, these are stories that actually happened in real life. I just have to believe that the story that the Bible tells is the accurate one.
Yep. Yeah. Well, coming back to that base assumption that the Bible is true, and then if you assume the Bible is true, then you can figure anything else out.
If you assume the Bible is true and everything it says, and you also assume that your God can do anything without question, then there's really not a problem you couldn't solve.
Yep.
Um, but if you try to apply that to another God or another holy book, then for some reason they don't seem so charitable. All of a sudden, the plot holes matter. The contradictions matter.
Yep. Yeah, but that's totally different ball game.
Right.
All right. Well, we had better call it a day. We've already gone an hour and only done like 3 chapters.
It doesn't feel like we've gone that long because it's like these are really fun topics to talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
But
Well, I thank you everyone for hanging with us. And we're going to just kind of keep going, slowly making our way through. Maybe we'll make it a few more chapters next time, but maybe not. Who knows? We'll take our time.